Good afternoon. This is Grant Swartzwelder. I'm president of OTA Environmental Solutions, and welcome to another edition of Oilfield Strong webinar series. As you know, we're on the YouTube under Oilfield Strong. You can see all of our other previous 53, 54 episodes, but this one you'll especially want to take note on. I'm very glad to have Michael Liebreich on as my guest. I've known Michael for 30 years. We were classmates at business school, and he has gone on to become a very successful entrepreneur with a heavy focus on clean energy and new energy, having started a new energy finance and selling it to Bloomberg, but then doing a variety of things from venture capital to sitting on boards. He's now a well-renowned speaker on these various issues, and so I was able to exploit my relationship with him to get him to come do this for free because, as you all know, I'm cheap and can't pay people for speeches. So Michael, I appreciate you letting me manipulate you to come speak, and look forward to the presentation today. So.
Thanks very much, Grant. Listen, you're the only person in the world I would probably pay to be on your podcast. So there you go. It's great to see you.
And real quick, let's throw that out because of the podcast. You have a fantastic podcast that I want to make sure you're able to, before we get started, give a quick pitch on what the podcast is. I've heard there was some guy named Tony Blair on. As an American, we don't know who that is. Haha. But well, I say haha, there's probably some that don't, but you have some fantastic speakers. Give a quick pitch on where it is and where to find it, and then we'll get started.
Right. So I have a podcast called Cleaning Up. And if you look for it on Spotify, it's also on YouTube. It's not the one about cleaning products. It's the one about climate and energy and net zero. And just doing this kind of stuff for so many years, decades now, I do have quite a good Rolodex. So we had Tony Blair, I've had Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister of Australia as well, Bill McKibben, because we do allow Americans as well. There's a really good selection of guests. Prince Albert of Monaco, who does extraordinary things for the environment. It's not only kind of big names. There's also just real experts. So somebody who really knows quantum computing and how it might play out across the energy space and across the climate space, or somebody who's a real expert on rare earths and critical minerals. So we really get into some detail, and every so often I get somebody on that I think is absolutely, how can I put it? I don't know what I'm allowed to say here, but full of it. And then I'll try and sort of dissect their business model and make sure that other people can understand exactly the kind of stunts they're trying to pull. But there's only a few episodes like that. Mostly it's real expertise and some big names, and we have a lot of fun.
No, so basically
so it's Cleaning Up, and the website is cleaningup.live, just to finish the plug. Right.
Okay, good. No, I urge everyone. So it's basically like Oilfield Strong, my little humble webinar, but just with smarter people and smarter discussion. So I urge everyone to find that and listen to Michael. So, all right, with that shameless plug out of the way, let's get started. I think it's probably appropriate to, given your background over in Britain and with the European Union, to kind of maybe start off with what the heck's going on over there and with energy specifically, and then kind of we'll feed that into kind of how that affects ultimately what U.S. is going to do on LNG and emissions and things like that. So just kind of start off, kind of put us everything in a certain context.
Right. Well, actually, it's interesting that you started that by saying that I'm over here in Britain and the EU. Of course, we're not anymore. But that's a great starting point, because really these last few years have been incredibly turbulent. That was just that's we've almost forgotten that we left the EU, because in between we've had COVID, the incredible disruption to energy. I mean, don't forget how it was only a few years ago the oil price went negative, right? Yes. Then coming out of COVID, all of the supply chains were fractured. We had this surge of demand. All the middle classes, they hadn't stopped working. They were working from home. They were earning, but they couldn't spend. And then you had this incredible sort of wave of spending that came back and hit these fractured supply chains. So suddenly you start getting the energy prices soaring. And then, of course, this appalling invasion of Ukraine by Russia, this illegal, this ghastly thing, which for Europe was cataclysmic, because it challenged many decades, 50 years of energy policy for continental Europe, which was, broadly speaking, we'll do all this kind of stuff on climate and we'll try to get to net zero, sort of. We'll shut down some nuclear because we don't like nuclear in certain countries. But underpinning it, don't worry about it because we got cheap Russian gas. We got oil, we've got commodities, fertilizer, whatever. So, but principally for European industry, it was Russian gas that underwrote it all, right? And then suddenly this breaks. And so it's just been, this is not like, I don't know, the 1973 oil crisis. This is oil, this is gas, this is commodities, this is everything, and has coincided, of course, with inflation, which has hit all of the infrastructure spend, and all of the models of clean energy. They're basically just, they're all capital spend and then no operating cost, a very low operating cost. And they're incredibly sensitive to interest rates. And those are now, the central bank rates are now 5% where they were 0% 3 years ago. So this is just, incredibly, we've never seen anything like this, I think, anywhere in the energy space, but particularly in Europe.
So do you end up, well, how does this play out? Because obviously you need natural gas, you need fossil fuels, you're having trouble from Russia, you've got a huge amount of pressure for continuing clean. So where do you go and find this energy?
So, you're right. There's a fossil piece to the answer and a clean piece to the answer. The fossil piece is really just, there's been a scrabbling around looking for, to replace the supply that we've lost from Russia, right? And so that's been, all hands on deck, get whatever you can, but also building some regasification trains. I don't know the exact number, but it's like 20 of them across Europe so that we can bring in LNG. And by the way, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our good friends in the US for opening the taps, opening the spigots and supplying us, because, we were lucky last year. We had a mild winter and we may not be as lucky this winter. So, our gas stores are in better shape going into this winter than last, but, we're not out of the woods yet. But the other thing that's been going on has been this kind of acceleration of all things clean, energy efficiency, but also production. So, and when I say all things, obviously some are faster than others. Solar, you've really seen just absolutely cusp upwards. Wind has been very badly hit by the higher interest rates. Nuclear takes forever to build anything, so we haven't seen that much. But, we've seen things like heat pumps and extraordinarily electric vehicles. Who'd have thought? Because every other energy crisis, what we've done is reach back for the comfort blanket, fossil fuels. Let's get more of them. Let's secure our supply. But not this time. This time there's been a bit of that, but there's been a lot more reaching for the clean stuff. And amongst them, electric vehicles, which are now at, 1 car in 3 in Europe has got a plug. So and that was way low. I don't know what the number exactly was, but it was like 4% back in 2019, 2020.
And it seems like that shift away from fossil fuels over in Europe might increase with the EU announcing about 4 or 5 days ago that they're really going to try to emphasize a reduction in fossil fuels by 2030, long-term contracts by 2027. Well, that's not too far away. So it's so can you really manage that? That's only 4 years to where the long-term contracts are. Where are you going to get this energy?
Yeah, so the EU was already working on quite ambitious plans driven by climate. I mean, that I forgot to even mention in the preamble. If we want to talk about sort of what's been happening in the last few years, don't forget that it was 2021 was the Glasgow climate, the COP26, they called it. So the Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC, which was the big climate summit in Glasgow. The UK government invested, under Boris at the time, invested a huge amount of political capital. And that was where all those pledges came to get to net zero by 2050. UK 2050, US pledged net zero by 2050, Europe net zero by 2050, Japan net zero 2050, and so on. so we've kind of, I don't want to say we've forgotten about it, but that underlies a lot of what's going on still in Europe. Of course, these other things happen on top of that and kind of stole the limelight. But nevertheless, the attempt to get to net zero in Europe is pretty real. Whether it's realistic and whether we'll get there, that's a different question. We'll get to that, I suspect. But there was a lot of policy that was coming out of particularly the EU to get to, to try to put some flesh on those bones. So you had things like Repower EU and Fit for 55, and they always have these kind of crazy names. So they accelerated that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They accelerated, and they're really going to try to get the 55 means 55% lower emissions by 2030 than there were in 1990. So it's quite a quite a dramatic. There's still a long way to go,
Sure.
to hit that. What I would say though is with the EU, I actually think that there's going to be a bit of a waking up between now and 2030, because it's very easy to have the conferences and to come up with these acronyms or these names for policy packages, but the actual sort of making it real, making it happen. Not only have you got to get from Brussels out to every country in the EU, but then you've got to get it into like the real world, into actual energy purchasers and actual, the real economy. And it's not impossible that they just fail at that they just fall short. And we've seen that before in the EU. And there's a lot of stuff, we may get on to talk about hydrogen and so on, where the goals are so astronomical and so sort of in defiance of physics and finance and economics that inevitably they will fall short. So,
there's talk about that it takes 6 to 7 trillion a year for the next 7-8 years to be able to meet the goal. Well, that's just undoable. So, just from an economic side, it won't happen. And then you wonder about when you start talking 2050, especially, but even 2030, you get so far out there, it's like, are you serious? Is it really going to have a chance to do? Because it's just so far out there, the numbers are so crazy.
Yeah, so look, when it comes to 2050, I must say I'm trying to spend most of my time looking at 2030, because that is, the way I look at it, that's kind of one business cycle away. I don't mean a recessionary cycle. I mean, you could decide to do something today. You could spend 2024, 2025 doing it, rolling it out, and then you'll see if it works. And boom, then you're going to be in 2030. So I'm looking, and as I look at it, whether it's investments or advising governments or advising corporates and so on, kind of focus on 2030, and where will we end up? We're not on track for these highfalutin sort of net zero 2050 1.5 degrees. We're going to blow through that. There's absolutely no question. But there are going to be very substantial changes between now and 2030, which is tomorrow in energy terms.
Right.
So, as an example, there's one of these climate summits coming up in Dubai in a few weeks, and they're going to. We already know some of the things they're going to say. One of them is going to be a tripling of renewable energy by 2030. And just to put it in perspective, today, wind and solar, not hydro, let's set hydro aside, but wind and solar and a few other bits and pieces, geothermal and a bit of biomass and so on, but mainly wind and solar, delivers 15% of all electricity worldwide. Right? It's much higher in Texas, by the way, but it's 15% worldwide. So what they're saying is the goal is 45%, plus or minus, by 2030. And they probably won't get there. We probably won't see that, but we will see 30%. 35%. We're going to, because of this kind of acceleration, and that's really disruptive in the electricity markets, particularly because, of course, what happens is sometimes there is no wind and solar, and sometimes there's too much, and the power prices drop to zero. And then you start looking around for, well, do we add some batteries, or do we, sell more electric vehicles so they can absorb that power? Or do we go to heat pumps so we electrify the heating so then we can kind of level out those spikes and this volatility, take advantage of when the electricity price goes to zero. All of that is going to be just accelerating enormously between now and 2030. That's really going to happen.
Let's see, And then the challenge is there's other byproducts of that, like Texas has solar, it has wind, but it doesn't have the transmission capability. The grid
Yeah.
system is woefully undercapitalized. And so it's great to have all that, but if you can't get it to the ultimate market, so there's more to it than just creating the solar program or the investment. There's other steps along the way that don't know if we've got that figured out.
Well, and by the way, you're not alone, right? You're not alone. Everywhere I go in the world, the grid transmission is the huge bottleneck, because we've kind of got to the point where, if you think about eras, there was a time, I go back to when I started this thing called New Energy Finance that I sold to Mike Bloomberg and Bloomberg in, the company in 2009. But at the beginning, when I founded that, 2004, I was one of the relatively few people who thought that wind and solar and all these things would actually be a thing, that they would scale. At the time, it was 1% of global electricity.
Right.
Now it's 15. Okay. So, electricity, of course, is only 20 odd % of global energy. So it's not like I'm saying, oh, job done, we've won. But it was 1%. Now it's 15. And what happened around 2010, 11, 12 was that I was one of the few people then who was saying electric cars, electric transport, land transportation is almost all going to go electric. And now we've seen that piece happen. We're going to see heating go to heat pumps, right? So all of this is sort of happening. Electrification is not just because of the climate, but also because it's just kind of a better, higher performing system for, the economy is electrifying. I think it's going to accelerate enormously for lots of reasons. But transmission, everywhere I go in the world, is the bottleneck. In the UK, we have to, if we want to hit the goals that we've got for 2030, 2035, but the Labour government that may come in, we're just going to have an election in a year or so, they want to do it in 2030, we would have to accelerate investment in transmission by a factor of something like 25.
It's
right?
unbelievable.
No, it's which is not doable. But Europe has got enormous transmission bottlenecks, so the electricity prices go negative whenever it's really windy and sunny. Japan, they've got 2 different frequencies on their grid, right? 50 hertz and 60 hertz. The US, you've got this sort of divide down the middle of the country where the grids aren't even connected, let alone the different electrical systems. So right. you can basically go around the world, and transmission is a bottleneck. So, you could turn that into an opportunity and say, hey, well, if we can get around those bottlenecks, either electrically or some other way, well, that's kind of interesting.
All right. I'm an only child from Texas, so it's always about me. So all this is great, but what does all of this that you're talking about with Europe and methane and clean, how's that going to affect America and the oil and gas producers in Texas? You look at responsibly sourced gas and needing to certify gas. You have LNG, so it's clearly a global market. How's this play out from our perspective?
So I think the first thing I would say is your markets are not going away, right? I mean, that's because, even if you look at this acceleration of renewables, it is only, which is going to be, very striking and very substantial. But remember, it's starting from 15% of electricity, which is only about 4% of energy globally. So, however much it accelerates, you've got decades. And I know there'll be people, possibly listening to this who say, how dare you, and don't you know about the 1.5 degrees and all that kind of stuff. But this stuff is not going to go away, quickly. I think also when you look at the EU, serving the EU as a market for LNG, it's going to look healthy. Again, we need it. What is broadly going to happen is all that Russian supply is going to go either south or east. So it's going to go to Asia, or it's going to go through, Turkey and Iran, and there's going to be plenty of demand for it. They're not, I hate to say it, they don't need to worry either. Sadly.
But with the EU announcement, it sure seemed like they would be pushing America possibly to a side and focusing on Norway, the North Sea, some other cleaner.
Yeah, so the EU is trying to put pressure on, particularly around sort of methane, fugitive methane, to go for clean supplies. And so, Norway and the UK, the North Sea, has got a pretty good record for methane losses, methane emissions, and flaring, and those sorts of things. I always love being proven wrong, but I think it's fair to say that we've got the cleanest gas supply in terms of both, methane and flaring. And the EU will be trying to export the pressure to the US. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, where we do buy gas from, I don't know, Algeria, or from Qatar, or from Tajikistan, or in some of it still coming from Russia.
Or Russia,
Then we have much more limited ability to influence than perhaps we would like to think that we might have on the US. So there will be a pressure to export those standards. Will it?
And how does that pressure? How does that pressure is going to be seen in America? What, I guess, through LNG requirements, certifying gas? Is that, or are there other, from capital, from pressure for environmental advocacy?
Yeah, no, well, it'll be clearly there'll be lots of advocacy. There'll be lots of people, protesting and doing all the usual things. But I think you will also see a certification system coming in that says, look, if you want to sell a cargo of LNG, then, whether it's come 2027 or for long-term contracts, or 2030 on the spot market, there will be an expectation that it is produced responsibly. But what I would say, and I've just come off the UK Board of Trade, I'm also aware that it's very easy to say that. It's very easy to, but actually there's some detail there. And there's cases in trade law about, well, can you discriminate between different types of dolphin that are responsibly fished or not responsibly fished, and how do you actually make sure that you're not illegal under trade law? So can we discriminate against a cargo of LNG that is produced with lots of with 3%, 4% fugitive methane versus one that's produced, and do we have the data, frankly? Is this just going to be self-reported with a whole bunch of people just say, oh yeah, me, fugitive emission? No, absolutely not. Okay, that's cool, check the box. Or is there going to be some real system there and some verification and, I don't know, using satellites? None of that is in place. None of that is in place.
And a lot of good questions, and you say it's not in place, which I definitely agree with, but do you see things within Britain or other places that are heading in a certain direction? Or is it just still too vague, a lot of talk?
No, I mean, I don't think it's vague. I think it's kind of the principle, particularly, I mean, look, the EU has just 6 days ago just passed this thing that they're going to do this, but it's so the principle is there, but the implementation it'll take 2 or 3 more years to know what is clean LNG, what is, or low, whatever they end up calling it. I don't think they'll want to call it clean, but, and also don't forget there's EU politics in all of this, in that you've got some countries that are very dependent on gas. And then you've got, France, which uses much less because it's got a lot more nuclear in its electricity.
Right.
And so there are different players. You've got Hungary and Austria still buying Russian gas, even today. So then they won't want something that says, well, imports of gas have to meet standard X, because they know full well that Russia is not going to meet that standard. So they don't want to then do something which through the back door blocks their ability to buy gas from their normal partners. So it's going to take a few years to get clarity. So, but it is a kind of one-way street. I mean, the EU will try to export its influence and to put pressure on through its, market power to clean up natural gas.
Now, far be it for Europeans or British folks to have opinions about how America does stuff, but when you start looking at all that we're doing from a methane reduction, emissions reduction, clean energy, what's the perception of how America is performing or not performing in the direction it's going?
Look, let me kind of be clear about my bias. My bias is, I have a couple of biases, which Grant will be well familiar to you.
I've known you a long time. Yes,
yeah.
That's a very factual statement.
Right. So I have strong opinions, right? But 2 of them are relevant here. One is that I like markets. I like, I'm not somebody who wants, global world government and degrowth and all those sorts of crazy things. I, am well aware that it is through private action that we see most of the good things, most of the innovation and the new technologies and the things that have, lifted all of us out of, poverty. But I also believe that climate change is real, right? Climate change is real, and it is caused by CO2 and methane. About a third of the warming that we've seen so far is actually caused by methane. And some proportion of that comes from oil and gas industry and the coal industry. So we have to kind of accept that that is happening. And my bias is I would like to see that dealt with.
Sure.
Now, I don't, but those two biases might pull in different directions. So some people are so committed to, private enterprise and capitalism and so on, that they don't want to accept that climate change could even be happening, because the reaction to it, there will need to, if you believe it's happening, and if you believe that it's not catastrophic yet today for most people in the world, but if you believe it's a one-way street that just gets worse and worse, which is frankly what the science says, then we have to deal with emissions. We have to deal with CO2 emissions, and we have to deal with methane emissions. So that's the kind of lens that I think I see, the US, and I think a lot of people in Europe see the US, which is there's this sort of pushback against action. It's very hard for me to know whether it's pushback because it's kind of, Texas not wanting interference at the federal level, or whether it's pushback kind of in general. I can't dissect that. But I do think it would be helpful for more, I would like to see action accelerated. Frankly, don't care whether it's driven federally or, at the state level. But there is a perception that the US is and the US industry is dragging its heels. And that's a great shame, because you've got the engineering, you've got the capital, the capital formation, you've got the services. I mean, I'm an advisor to a geothermal company. And we would love to, it's fantastic technology to provide heat for district heating in Europe. Where do you get the rigs from in Europe? We don't have the supply chain. We don't have the skills that you've got in the US. So to me, the fact that the North Sea, is the best in the world at, low flaring, low emission, low fugitive emissions, that should be a source of embarrassment, frankly, to the great US oil and gas sector. You should be, it should be a matter of pride to be better than on all fronts, not just the cheapest, but also the cleanest.
But now on that, just for clarification, when you have these large wells, fairly newly drilled, relatively, wouldn't you think that that's easier to maintain and reduce emissions as opposed to a very fragmented industry with a lot of older type wells that economically can't handle that? So I agree with your point, and that's what makes the North Sea so great from a methane standpoint. But the underlying point of it is that they've got the advantage, and same reason you're going to like electricity, because you can have these big generation plants and you can maintain or justify the capital to maintain the methane and the slip right there, as opposed to fragmenting it all over the place.
No, that's look. First of all, the North Sea actually, and it's been 50 years, but it is, it's subsea. It's it's different. I don't know, to be honest. I'll be completely honest. I don't know exactly how it compares with, for instance, Gulf of Mexico, right, where you might, get a more appropriate comparison. What we don't have clearly is these kind of, wide areas, especially that, that with lots and lots of nodding donkey wells and fracking and all those sorts of things. But, in a sense, it's kind of, we've all got to work with what we've got. If that's your situation, you've got a lot of abandoned wells and older wells, and it's distributed across wide areas and so on. That doesn't, the planet, it doesn't care about that. The atmosphere doesn't care about that. And I'm going to say it, that the EU, the Europeans are not going to care about that. They're just going to say, look, if we're going to buy gas, it has to be compatible with a net zero pathway, and it's going to have to, adhere to whatever standards. They are going to say that. And that's your client base to a certain extent. Now,
yep, no, that's true.
could you fiddle it? Could you say, well, you know what, we'll sell, we've got these fields which are really good, and we'll sell those, we'll sell the output from that to Europe, and we'll sell the output from something else to the Asians who don't care, or whatever. There could be some of that, right? But fundamentally, I also think that there's an ethics point. Do you remember we went to, Harvard Business School, we did ethics.
What?
We should not be trying to sort of shimmy through this whole, sorry?
No,
Yeah.
I had forgotten that we did that, but
Yeah.
I'm teasing. I'm teasing.
Okay. No, I was.
I'm sure I got a fantastic grade in that class. So
I think it was unmarked. Do you remember? It was ungraded because they were very worried that somebody would sort of fess up to some terrible thing. I don't know. But no, but my point is, look, we are all also, not all, but most of us are parents. Some of us are grandparents. We are citizens. I want to make sure that my net impact is good. And so, as I was going to say, shimmying through business, saying, oh, well, we can get away with this here, and we can get away with that there, and hey, it's only self-reporting, and if I get a fine, it's much smaller than the benefit. That's not how to do business. I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm not that I'm accusing anybody, but you know what I mean?
No, but there's definitely folks out there in the environmental advocacy folks that don't believe that the industry is reporting. And as you know, we've got a data company that we see that the data isn't being submitted accurately and consistently. So unfortunately, the market is going to prove us to be not the best data providers. Now, in light of all that, we're also doing the methane tax, we're doing Quad OB, we're doing various things that are going to require even more data. And then we're going to pay accordingly. So there's definitely a sea change on the federal side with the Biden administration, what they're doing with EPA to change all of that and really put a target on the industry's back. So we'll see how that affects. But your point about data, I think it's only going to be more and more important on how you manage that data.
And also, let me put it in finance terms. Fundamentally, it's not just a question of personal ethics; it's also a question of risk and risk management. Because of course, we don't know what's going to happen. You also have an election next year. We don't know what's going to happen. Maybe that federal pressure to pay for methane or to regulate it, maybe that goes away. Who knows? But you can never assume that it's gone forever, right? And so I would suggest, if I'm also an investor in various things, as an investor, I would like the companies that I invest in to understand the risks that they face. And that means measuring. So it starts with data, measuring, being absolutely sure that and of course, in many cases, the fact is, methane is money. So I would also like to know that the companies I invest in are well managed, that if they have got, methane leakage, and if that they have worked out, I suppose, I'd be very unhappy if they looked at it and said, well, we know there's a huge leak, but we did the numbers and it's not worth capping it off, or it's not worth doing whatever. But I'd be very surprised if that was the case. I think that if, with the skills and the supply chain that you've got and companies such as your own, if people got serious about it, they could take a huge bite out of those fugitive emissions and make more money. And it would make more, and it would be safer as well. And that's a huge piece.
Well, and the other part that it's hard to quantify, but I still maintain if you worry about the details on methane and emissions and have that culture of really taking care of the details, that carries over in better management, better operations in everything you do. And so it really creates a wider culture than just an environmental culture. But we'll let someone from Harvard Business School kind of figure that out and write a big case study on that.
No, so I agree with you. And I was the Transport for London, which is the transport authority for London. It's one of the biggest transport authorities in the world. I was on the board for 6 years under Boris Johnson, but also under the current mayor, Sadiq Khan. And I was deputy chair and then chair of the safety panel. And so I got really deep into this. And the assumption that you can save money on safety, you don't save money on safety, right? You may short term, but longer term, it'll always come and bite you. And it'll bite you in ways that you can't predict. It may be a big failing, but it may be just that you lose staff, or it may be that your operations are just poor. And it may be that you are not a preferred bidder for something because of whatever just, hit the news. There'll be lots of ways in which those shortcuts will bite you. And so I just think, get this stuff right, do it right across the board, have good governance, and, that's the way to do business.
Good. Well, Michael, I've already taken up way more time than I had twisted your arm for. So thank you very much for talking to me and to the audience. And always find your comments insightful and well-grounded on fact and experience. So thank you, Michael. Appreciate this.
My pleasure. And it's always a pleasure to talk with you. So anytime I can be of any use, any help, and good luck.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mike.